Okay, hello Cloud Gurus and welcome to this lecture. This lecture we're going to start with IAM policies. We're going to have an overview of what they are theoretically. We're then going to log into the console and we're going to use two different types of policies. We're going to use an AWS managed policy, then we're going to create our own, and we're then going to log in as another user and we're going to see how that policy takes effect. So let's talk about IAM policies. And basically IAM policies specify what you are allowed to do with any AWS resource. They're global and they apply to all areas of AWS. So not just S3, not just EC2, not just Lambda, they apply everywhere. You can apply an IAM policy to every single service within AWS. And you attach IAM policies to IAM users, to groups, or to roles. And these users, groups, and roles are then subject to the permissions that you define within the policy. In other words, IAM policies define what a principal can do in your AWS environment. So what are the three different types of policies? Well, we have AWS managed policies, we have customer managed policies, and then we have inline policies. So let's start with AWS managed policies. An AWS managed policy is basically a standalone policy that's created and administered by AWS. So you do not write these at all. AWS write them for you. They'll have an Amazon resource name that everyone uses. So these policies are shared across literally hundreds of thousands or millions of AWS accounts. And they are the same policy applied across multiple accounts. And they actually can change. Granted, they're minor changes. Obviously, AWS want to be very careful when updating the AWS managed policies because of the number of users that they can affect. They wouldn't just suddenly, deny a specific permission in there unless there was some kind of security issue or something. But just bear in mind that AWS managed policies are managed by AWS. They're great templates. There's heaps of them out there. They're the best way to get started. You can have things like administrator. You can have things like power users. An administrator user can basically touch everything other than billing. So it's basically admin access across the whole AWS environment. A power user can do everything aside from accessing identity access management and making changes in there. Then you can get read-only users. You can get S3 admin access. You can get DynamoDB admin access, DynamoDB read-only. We'll go through and have a look at all the different policies that AWS give us. And pretty much 9 times out of 10, there'll be a policy to suit our use case. However, for that 1 out of 10 chance that you don't have, or maybe you just don't like the idea that AWS can make a change to this policy at any given time, and it could go and break your production environment, you might want a customer managed policy. And the customer managed policy is just a standalone policy that you administer in your own AWS account. And you can then attach the policies to multiple principal entities in your account, so to multiple users, multiple groups, multiple roles, etc. And once you attach it to the principal entity, you're giving them the permissions that are defined within that policy. Now, you can cut and paste policies and use them across multiple AWS accounts, but the actual policy itself, in terms of IAM, will exist in that AWS account, and you could only use it within that AWS account. It's not like an AWS managed policy that's used across multiple accounts, so do bear that in mind. And then finally, we have inline policies, and these are useful if you want to maintain a strict one-to-one relationship between a policy and the principal entity that it's applied. For example, you may want to make sure that a permission in a policy is not inadvertently assigned to somebody else other than the person that they're intended for. So you might write a policy specific to an individual employee or to an individual group, and you don't want that policy to be reused across your AWS account. You would then basically put that policy in line, and it can only be used by that entity. Of course, you can copy and paste the actual JSON document and then recreate it somewhere else, but they are separate policies. If you wanted to make changes, you'd have to go in and update both. So let's go ahead and log into the AWS console. Okay, so here I am in the AWS console. I'm going to scroll down and go to IAM under Security, Identity, and Compliance. Now, the first thing I want you to do is just customize your IAM user sign-in link. So I'm just going to delete this for now, and I'm going to go ahead and customize it and put in an account alias in here. So I might have this as, I don't know, security. This is my security AWS account, used to be my certified cloud practitioner account. And don't forget, it is a global namespace. So I'm going to say a cloud guru. Go ahead and hit yes, create. So security acloudguru.signin.aws.amazon.com/console. You have to create your own. Once we've done that, what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to create a new user and a new group. And then we're going to add that user to the group, and then we're going to assign some policies to that group. So let's go ahead and we'll just start with the group. We're going to create a new group. So we'll call this group My S3 Users Group. And we're going to go ahead and hit next. And that's asking us already for a policy. So we can use an AWS managed policy, or we can use our own custom managed policies. And the way that you tell the difference between them is the AWS managed policies have the little AWS icon, and then your own custom managed policies won't have that icon. So these are all ones that I've created for myself. So if we type in S3 and we click on S3 read-only access, we're going to use the Amazon policy for S3 read-only access. So I'm going to go ahead and hit next, and I'm going to go ahead and create. So we can see that my S3 users now has a policy of S3 read-only access. You can actually go in and show the policy, and the policy is really, really simple. It's just a simple piece of JSON. It starts with the version. It's always key value pairs. So the version is this. It's a dated version. The statement is this. So this is the key. This is the value enclosed in these square brackets. And then, of course, within, you can have nested JSON. So within the square brackets, we've got our curly brackets, and we've got effect, allow, and then the action, and then we've got more embedded JSON. So we've got the square brackets again, and then we've got S3 get and S3 list, and then we've got this asterisk, which is a wild card. So we're basically saying the statement is we're going to effect, allow, so we're going to allow the following action, and the only two actions we're allowed is S3 get and S3 list, but we're allowed to get everything and list everything. And then we're applying this statement to which resource? Well, to everything, so across our entire AWS account, but it's only being applied to, obviously, to S3 in terms of these actions here. So we're basically allowing us to get and list everything within S3. So it's a read-only access. We cannot do any writes with this policy. So now that we have seen that policy and it's attached to our group, you can see it's in here, permissions, manage policy, attach policy. You can also see our inline policies in here. You could click in here and create one. I'm not going to do it because it is actually beyond the scope of this course. It doesn't really feature in the exam all that much. So what we're going to do now is go ahead and create our user. I'm going to go add my user, and I'm going to call him my S3 user. I'm going to allow them console access, and I'm going to create a custom password. So I'm just going to enter in a password here, and I'm not going to ask them to reset that password next time they sign in. I'm going to go ahead and hit next, and I'm not going to give them any permissions, but I am going to add them to a group, so they will inherit the permissions of my S3 users. And you can already see here it's an attached policy. It's Amazon S3 read-only access. We scroll all the way down, we'll be able to hit next, review, and we'll go ahead and create our user. So our user now is created. Go ahead and hit close. So my user is called my S3 user, and I'm going to go and log in. So I'm going to go to this address here using my S3 user, and I'm going to log in, and I'm going to go ahead and just have a quick look at S3. We'll try and create a bucket, and we'll try and write some objects to the bucket, and obviously it's not going to work, but let's go ahead and do that now. Okay, so I've clicked on that link. I'm now going to log in as my S3 user and enter my password. Sign in. It's my very first time signing in using this user. Going to go ahead and click on services, and I'm going to go to storage S3, and straight away we'll be able to see that this user is able to view everything within S3. So I'm able to view all the bucket names. I'm able to go in and open up and have a look at these buckets. So let's go ahead and have a look at one of my, this is my Poly website bucket. I can go into my index.html. I could go ahead and view that file. I could download it. Let's go ahead and hit download just so you can see. No issue accessing this. What if I go and I try and delete this? So go to more, delete. I don't want this, this file. Go ahead and hit delete, and you'll be able to see that there's been an error down here and it says 100% failed. And that's simply because I don't have the permissions to delete that object. Similarly, if I tried to add a file, so here we go, I've got a hello.txt. I'm going to go ahead and hit open and go ahead and hit upload. And of course, I won't be able to do that. I'm going to get an error because I do not have permissions. Let's log out actually, before we even log out, let's just test one last thing. Let's go over to another service. So let's try and view EC2, for example. Now you remember that I've only got read-only access to S3. So I may even get a dashboard or a splash screen. It really depends, but it will basically won't give me any information. So it will say, you are not authorized to describe running instances. You are not authorized to describe dedicated hosts, etc. So I am limited in terms of what I can see. I won't be able to see anything within EC2, and the reason behind that is I just do not have any permissions. So let's log out and log back in as my root user, and I'm going to go ahead and then add some more policies. Okay, so I've logged back into the AWS console as my root account user. You could also do this as an administrator user. You couldn't do this as a power user though, because power users do not have access to IAM. Do remember that going into your exam. So what we want to do now is go over to policies, and we're going to go ahead and create our own policy. So this is our own customer managed policy. Now you could be really hardcore and just write out the JSON yourself. It's entirely up to you. I don't do this normally. I just use the visual editor. I find it a lot easier. So we're going to go ahead and select our service. I'm going to type in S3. And then we want to go ahead and select our actions. And you can see here it breaks it down into our different access level groups. So list, read, write, permissions. You could just give it all write permissions, which will give it 29. But of course, you always want to apply least privilege. So you only want to allow the privileges that you specifically want. You shouldn't just go ahead and just give it everything that you want. So what I'm going to do, or everything that's available to you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and just allow put object. I'm going to allow one write policy for this customer managed policy. In here, we've got our resources. So we've got the resources that we want. We could be specific, or we could say all resources. I'm going to say all resources. I don't want to specifically name an S3 bucket. And then I'm going to go ahead and hit review policy. And then in here, you can see S3 limited. We're going to write, but we're going to allow write to all resources within S3. And I'm going to go ahead, before I create the policy, I need to name it. So we'll call it my S3 write object policy, something like that. And then the description, this allows me to write objects only. Something like that. And then go ahead and hit create policy. That has now created our S3 policy, and we can go ahead in here and just type in my S3. You'll be able to go in and view it. If you click on this little down arrow, it's going to load the JSON. We could have just typed this out ourselves. It's very, very simple. Again, we've got our version. So here's our key value pair. So our version is the key, the value is that. Statement is the key. The statement's value is a nested JSON. So we've got multiple values, key value pairs in here. So we've got our key, so our SID, we've got our effect, which is allow, we've got action, so we've got S3 put object, and the resources, so anything within S3 we're allowing to be written, so we're allowed to write to any S3 bucket. So let's go over to our groups, and we're going to click on my S3 users, and we're going to click in on the group itself. We're going to go ahead and attach the policy. Again, you can see your custom policies here. They don't have the AWS icon on them, so I'm going to type in my S3 write object policy, and I'm going to go ahead and attach that policy. I'm going to now log out. I'm going to log in as this user here, my S3 user, and I'm going to see if I can upload that file. Just going to type in my S3 user, and in here I'm going to type in my password. I'm going to go ahead and log in. Hopefully I remember the password. There we go. And I'm going to go over to S3, and we're going to upload a file. Just hit never over here. So S3, we'll go over to my Poly website. which I've already got a bucket. I mean, we could even try and create a bucket because we do have a limited amount of write access. If I just enter anything random in here and go ahead and hit create, I am going to get an error and it just says access denied. So the only thing I can do is go in and write, but I can write to all these buckets. So let's go over to my Poly website. Let's go ahead and upload a file. I'm going to add my files. I'm going to add in hello.txt. Going to go ahead and just hit upload. That has now started to upload the file. You can see it's a success and I can view it in here. Now, this bucket itself is actually public, so it would already be shared by default. If I was to upload this into a private bucket, I couldn't go in and change the permissions and make it public because I don't have that level of access. Likewise, I can't go in and delete this object, so I can't go in and just hit delete. I can write only, but I cannot go through and delete. I can read it, of course, and it's inheriting the bucket permissions as well. And that really leads us on to the next thing. What happens if you've got, well, actually, let's cover off bucket permissions first. So we're going to go in the next lecture and we're going to start setting some S3 bucket policies. And these will apply individually to your S3 bucket. So remember, IAM is at a global level. It's not just at S3, it's at EC2. You saw before we couldn't access EC2. We can create permissions at a global level across our AWS accounts. We can even use AWS managed policies, which apply across multiple AWS accounts. So they're the ones that AWS manage themselves. But we might want to start locking things down. Like we might want to restrict access to an individual bucket. And we might not want to do that through IAM. We might want to do that through S3. And we can do that using S3 bucket policies. So that's what we're going to cover off in the next lecture. So before we do that, just remember this going into your exam. IAM is global. It applies to all areas of AWS, not just S3. And we have 3 different types of IAM policies. We've got AWS managed policies, and these can apply across multiple AWS accounts. We then have customer managed policies. These are ones that you create and are account specific, but they can apply across multiple users, multiple groups, multiple roles, etc. We then have inline policies, and this is where you have a one-to-one relationship. So you might create a specific policy just for one user or one group, and then that way you know that it's only aligned to that one user and group. It's not being used elsewhere. So in the next one, we're going to look at S3 bucket policies. We're then going to look at S3 access control lists, and then after that, we're going to look at what happens if there's a conflict between IAM, between S3 policies, bucket policies, and S3 access control lists. How do you resolve that conflict? And that is worth a huge amount in the exam. You probably could not pass the exam without that knowledge. That's why we teach it so early on in the course. So if you've got the time, please join me in the next lecture where we cover off S3 bucket policies.